In this project, I am building a piece of furniture that most people would probably think is unnecessary. However, it makes me happy when I see this finished piece of furniture in my home, especially when it is being enjoyed by the intended customer. In the last few clips, I have been breaking down my lumber into each of the project's components, and now I am milling the lumber using my jointer and planer. The unnecessary piece of furniture that I am building is a bed frame. Now, unless you are a frat boy, this might not sound like a piece of unnecessary furniture to you. But given the size of these parts, it may be obvious that this is not intended for a person. Before explaining who this bed frame is for, first we're going to get into building the carcass. This carcass is going to be made using mitered corners, and here I am cutting a rabbet along the bottom to hold the frame. Next, I'm marking out the dominoes that will provide additional structure to the mitered corners. I'm making sure to use the same reference edge for each of the pieces to ensure proper alignment when I glue it up later. With the location of the dominoes marked, I can now cut out the mortises. With the carcass frame dry assembled, I can now begin building the bottom frame that will hold up the bed. The first thing I am doing is cutting down the rails of the frame to proper size using the frame as a reference. With the rails cut to size, I can then push them together and measure the length for the stiles. At the table saw, I can sneak up on the fit for the stiles and then set up a stop block to cut them all out. With the rails and stiles of the frame cut to length, I have dry fit them together using offcuts for spacing. I would like to say that I had planned for this to be the proper spacing, but that was just lucky. I'm now marking out for dominoes to hold the frame together. With the rails and stiles marked, I can now cut out the mortises for the domino. With the frame dry assembled, I am now marking out the rails for the chamfers that I am going to put on the exposed edges. I do not want the chamfers to run along the full length of the rails, or there will be a gap where they meet the stiles. Here I am cutting out the chamfer along the stiles. And the stopped chamfer along the rails. While cutting out these chamfers, I'm double checking to make sure that I am cutting out the right sections. Using this technique for cutting out the chamfers means that there is a little bit of material left along the rails that has to be cleaned up. If I was to have used the router on the assembled frame, it would have created a round corner where the rails meet the stile. Here, what I am doing is using a chisel to slowly scribe and cut away at the chamfer in order to make it 90 degrees where it meets up. While I like clean out this corner, I can tell you that this bed frame is going to be for my dog. Now you might say to yourself, does a dog really need a solid walnut bed frame? And the answer is probably no. But I have two reasons why I think that this was still a worthwhile project. And I will get to these two reasons once I disassemble the bed frame and sand the interior edges, which will be difficult to get to once the frame has been glued up. Back to the first reason why I believe that this is still a worthwhile project is because I am reminded all of the time by my girlfriend that when I first met her, that my bed consisted of a mattress and box spring on the floor, and that this was a red flag and she should have ran the other way. While I don't think that my dog will be getting into a relationship anytime soon, it won't hurt for him to have a stylish and functional bed frame to keep his mattress off the floor. With the frame and clamps drying, I can now get to work on making the legs for the bed frame. I have created a template for the foot portions of the leg, as well as a stretcher that I'll be creating. Now, these legs are fairly short, so I could have potentially gotten them out of one piece, but that would have created some weakness in the cross grain. What I've done instead is laid out my templates close together in order to try and get continuous grain throughout the legs. Here I have the pieces of the leg at the bandsaw, and I'm just roughly cutting them down and then cutting out the curved portions. When laying out the templates on the leg blank, I made sure that the templates were along a square edge to use as a reference. I can then use the template to set up a sled for the table saw in order to cut the angles where the pieces of the legs will meet. To cut the second angle on the legs, I'm setting up a stop block so that the stretchers are the same length. I can then cut the angle for the feet of the leg assembly. I will cut the bottom of the feet once the leg is assembled. With the angles cut on the leg pieces, I can now use my domino joiner to create some mortises. These dominoes will provide strength to the leg assembly. With the mortises for the dominoes cut, I could glue and assemble the legs. While I assemble these legs, I can tell you about the second reason why I built this project. As you have seen, a lot of the joinery in this project has been using the domino joiner. When starting this project, I had recently purchased my domino joiner from Facebook Marketplace. I designed this project to be able to practice and learn how to use it properly. After the legs had dried, I used a sled at the router table and a template bit to begin cutting out the interior curve of the legs. I removed the leg assembly from the sled and finished off the curve with a flush frame bit. Cutting out the feet for the leg assembly, I did not cut out the bottom angle where the feet will meet the ground. That is because there may have been some play when assembling the legs that could have caused the bed to rock. What I've done is taken the leg assembly and attached it to a sled in order to make sure that the bottoms of all of the legs are going to be the same. Here I'm cutting out a rabbet in the leg that will hold the frame in the carcass. After watching back this video, I realized that I had done this task incorrectly and I should have had a sacrificial fence attached and the blade buried in it. This would stop any potential for kickback if that leg was to slide out. With the leg assembly completed, I could now round over the edges at the router table. With the frame and the carcass, I'm marking out some dominoes along the front and the back in order to be able to hold it. As this bed is fairly wide, I didn't want the frame to sag in the middle. Here I am using a template and a flush trim router bit to create the opening on the front so that my dog is able to easily get into the bed. For assembly, I'm going to round over the edges of the carcass and then sand the interior part of the carcass, as it will be difficult to get it done once it's glued up. I am also going to sand and pre-finish the panel before assembly. To secure the legs to the side of the carcass, I'm going to be using screws. This is because once the bed frame is assembled, the bottom frame will hide these screw heads. As extra security, so that the legs do not splay out, I am also going to add some glue to this joint. To assemble the legs to the side of the carcass, I started the screws so that I was able to get it in the proper position. I could then use some scraps of plywood to securely clamp the pieces together. After clamping, I could then finish tightening down the screws. With the sub-assemblies complete, I can now do the final glue up. I'm starting by pre-gluing dominoes into the miter joints of the front and back. I am not using glue on the dominoes that are going to be holding the bottom panel to the front and back of the carcass to account for any potential wood movement. The potential for wood movement is also why I pre-finished the bottom panel. I did not want there to be any potential to see unfinished wood if the panel were to shrink. With the frame assembled and dry, I can now do the finish sanding. When rounding over the corners with the router, I did not go right to the edge, and I'm going to just finish that up using a sanding block. I did this so that I could hide any alignment issues that may have arisen with the glue up. With the sanding complete, I can now begin finishing. I'm using Osmo Satin Hard Wax Oil for the finish and applying it with a white Scotch-Brite pad. I'm sorry about the terrible quality of this video. I was doing the finishing in my basement where there is much worse lighting than out in my shop. After leaving the first coat to dry for 24 hours, I went back and added a second coat of finish to the bed frame. And with a little coaxing from a treat, I had a dog who was happy with his fancy, but probably unnecessary bed frame.